Maison Rouge Restaurant. Friday, 8 p.m. Marcus walked in, his hand tightening around the waist of the woman beside him. His smug smile hadn't even faded when his eyes suddenly froze. The VIP table in the corner, candlelight flickering. And Elena, the wife he had divorced just 3 months ago, was sitting there, visibly pregnant, shoulder to shoulder with a man the entire city knew by name, the CEO of Navarre's Corporation. Elena looked up. Their eyes met not with humiliation, but with something far colder. She smiled faintly, then turned to the man beside her. Daniel, this is someone I used to know. Daniel gave a slight nod, unbothered the way a man looks at someone completely invisible, and that look cut deeper than any insult ever could. Marcus opened his mouth. Not a single word came out. The child in Elena's womb, was it his, or did it belong to the powerful man sitting right across from him? The whole truth more bitter than you'd ever expect. Stay tuned and don't miss a single second. I want you to picture something very specific. It is a Thursday evening in November, one of those New York nights where the cold comes in off the river and makes everything feel sharper than it should. The kind of night where your breath hangs in the air before disappearing, and you find yourself noticing small things you would normally walk right past without seeing. The restaurant is called Hargrove's. It sits on the Upper East Side, tucked between an art gallery and a building with a doorman who nods at the right people. If you have to ask what dinner costs there, you probably cannot afford it. White tablecloths, crystal glasses that catch the candlelight and throw small reflections across the ceiling. The kind of place where the lighting makes everyone look like the best version of themselves. And the silence between tables is considered a luxury worth paying for. I was 5 months pregnant. I was also, as of 6 weeks prior, officially and legally divorced. My ex-husband was at a corner table near the window, the same corner where he had asked me to marry him 11 years ago. And I wonder sometimes if he remembered that. His hand was resting on the hand of the woman across from him. He was leaning forward the way he used to lean when he was charming someone. He was laughing. I did not plan to walk into that restaurant. I tell people that, and they look at me with a small knowing smile, like they assume I am being modest. But I mean it genuinely. I had not chosen Hargrove's with any deliberate strategy. I had simply agreed to dinner, had given a neighborhood, and the man walking beside me had made a reservation and said be ready at 7. But some part of me knew, some part of me understood that certain chapters cannot close until they have been looked at directly and clearly was what I intended to do. I pushed through the door, the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around me, and I felt the slight shift that happens in rooms when something unexpected enters, a subtle adjustment in the air, heads that turn without meaning to. The man walking beside me placed his hand at the small of my back, steady and warm, and he leaned down so that only I could hear. He said, "You do not have to do anything, just walk." So I walked, and my ex-husband looked up from his dinner, and the world, for one complete and crystalline moment, went entirely still. His glass slipped. The woman beside him caught it before it fell, but not before the water spread across the white tablecloth in a slow, inevitable bloom. He looked at me. He looked at the man beside me. He looked back at me. I held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then I walked to my table. I did not hurry. I did not look back. And in those few steps across a restaurant in the Upper East Side, something that had been coiled tight inside me for 8 months finally, quietly, let go. But to understand what that moment meant, you need to understand everything that came before it. You need to understand who I was before my name became a headline, before my signature became evidence, and before a man I had never met knocked on the door of a motel room in Queens and told me he believed I had the power to bring down one of the most influential men in New York. My name is Claire Harmon, and this is the story of the 8 months that remade me. I met Garrett Voss when I was 25 years old at a networking event in Midtown Manhattan that I attended primarily because my coworker promised the food would be worth the trip. It was not. But Garrett was standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water and a pitch deck he had printed at a copy shop on Lexington Avenue. Explaining his idea to anyone who paused long enough to listen, I paused. Not because I was immediately charmed, though I was, but because the idea itself was genuinely interesting. I had spent enough years working as a certified public accountant to recognize when someone understood numbers, not just as calculation but as language. Garrett heard things in data that other people missed. He could look at a market and anticipate its movement the way a good sailor reads the water before the wind changes. We talked for 2 hours that night. We had coffee the following Tuesday. Within a month, we were inseparable. I want to be careful here, because I think people expect me to say I should have seen it coming, that there were signs I chose to ignore, that the man who would eventually shatter my life was always somewhere underneath the surface. the person he became. I do not believe that. The man I fell in love with at 25 was genuinely the person I believed him to be. He was brilliant and driven and unexpectedly warm, and he was completely committed to building something that mattered. He wanted to change the way companies process supply chain logistics. It was not the most romantic business model, but his passion for it was entirely real. We married when I was 27. We moved into an apartment in Murray Hill that cost more than we could comfortably afford and required both of us working at full capacity to maintain. I covered rent during the months when investor meetings went nowhere. I cooked dinner late at night because that was when he finally stopped working. I declined 2 promotions that required travel because he needed me available. And I told myself that was a choice I was making freely, because in those days it genuinely felt like one. He launched Vostech formally when he was 32. By that point, we had been married for 5 years, and I knew every version of his vision and every iteration of the business plan and every investor who had said no at least once. I was his first believer and his most consistent one. There was one habit I had that seems worth mentioning here, because it matters enormously to everything that follows. My mother had been hard of hearing since I was in middle school, not completely deaf, but enough that phone conversations were difficult for her. She had taught me, when I was a teenager, to record important calls so I could replay them for her afterward. Job offers, apartment negotiations, anything she might want to hear again more clearly. The habit stuck. I had a voice recording application on my phone that I switched on automatically during any call that seemed significant. I had been doing it for 20 years. I never thought of it as anything other than a small practical accommodation for my mother. I thought about it a great deal later. Before we reach that part, there is something I need to ask you to do, and I ask it with complete sincerity. If someone you love is ever in business, and they begin putting documents in front of you with the phrase, "It is just routine," please stop. Please read every page. Not because you suspect dishonesty, not because you are preparing for a worst-case scenario, but because your signature is your legal identity. And signing documents you have not read is handing over something that cannot be taken back. Read what you sign, every time, without exception. I did not. And the consequences of that small omission, accumulated across 13 years and 400 pages of unread documents, nearly destroyed me. But in the beginning, in the early years of Vostech, and tight budgets and late dinners, and the specific kind of partnership that comes from building something together from nothing, I was happy. We were happy. Then the money came, and everything changed. Vostech went viral. That is the only accurate description for what happened. One partnership with a major venture capital fund, one profile in a technology publication, one quarter where the numbers broke through every projection, and Garrett Voss became someone the world wanted to photograph. I watched the transformation from very close proximity, and I want to describe it accurately because the way it happened matters more than the fact that it did. It was not sudden. That would have been easier to name and therefore easier to respond to. It was gradual, like a tide coming in so slowly you do not notice until the water is around your ankles. The wardrobe changed first, not dramatically, just better. Suits that fit differently, shoes that cost 4 times what they used to, a watch that arrived in a velvet box in which he wore every day after that. Then the way he talked in public became more careful, and the way he talked at home became less so. The warmth that had always been his most compelling quality began to feel rationed, something he deployed in professional settings and withheld in private ones. Then the hours changed. He had always worked late, but there is a difference between working late and being unreachable. And by the second year after Vostech's breakthrough, Garrett had crossed that line and showed no sign of noticing. I noticed. I told myself it was the pressure of running a company that had grown faster than anyone anticipated. I told myself that success at that scale required sacrifices that affected both people in a marriage. I told myself the distance I felt was a phase, and that we would find our way back to each other when things settled. Then Sloane Crawford arrived. She was hired as Vostech's vice president of communications when the company was preparing for its first major public funding round. 34 years old, exceptionally good at her job, the kind of person who understood not just how to shape a narrative, but how to feel the room and adjust in real time. I met her twice at company events and found her entirely professional and completely unreadable, which I now understand was the point. The signs that followed were, I am told, obvious to people watching from the outside. Late meetings that ran until midnight, a phone kept face down on every surface, business trips that multiplied in frequency, a new cologne that appeared without explanation. I did not want to see what I was seeing. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. It was not naivety. I am not a naive person. It was a deliberate choice to look at the evidence and select a different explanation. Because the true explanation required me to dismantle a life I had spent 13 years building. And I was not ready to do that. I was ready on a Tuesday in March when I took a pregnancy test in a coffee shop bathroom 2 blocks from my office because I could not wait until I got home. Positive, I sat in that stall for 11 minutes. Not because I did not understand what I was looking at, but because I was trying to memorize the feeling. Not fear, not exactly. Something more complicated. Something that had the texture of joy and the weight of gravity arriving simultaneously. I was going to be a mother. I had wanted this for years. Garrett and I had spoken about children carefully, and then urgently, and then with a sadness we handled by not speaking of it anymore. I had quietly accepted that perhaps it was not going to happen, and here it was, happening. I planned to tell him Friday evening. I bought a card. I had a speech prepared. I wanted to do it properly. He came home on Thursday. He was not alone. Sloane Crawford stood in my kitchen at 10:47 on a Thursday night, wearing a coat she had not taken off. Her presence carrying the specific quality of something that has been decided without your knowledge or consent. Garrett stood in the entryway with his own coat still on. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between resignation and relief. Like a man who had been dreading something for so long that having it finally arrive felt almost like a release. He said, "Claire, I think you know what this is." I said, "No. Tell me what this is." He said, "I am sorry this happened this way, but Sloane and I have been together for 8 months, and I cannot keep pretending that is not true." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the back of the kitchen chair. I said, "We are married, Garrett." He said, "I know." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt much longer. I said, "I am pregnant." What I wanted was for those words to do something to his face. For something human to break through the careful composure he was maintaining. I watched his expression very closely in those seconds. I watched for softness, for shock, for the particular fracturing that comes when something unexpected reaches a person who still cares. His expression shifted for 3 seconds. Then he straightened his jacket collar. He said, "We will figure out the practical arrangements. I will have my lawyer call." Sloane looked at the floor. I looked at my husband, and I understood, with the clear, cold certainty that arrives only after all the self-deception has finally burned away, that he had already decided. He had made this decision before he walked through the door. He had rehearsed this. And the pregnancy, the child we had waited years for, was simply an inconvenient variable he had not accounted for but had decided would not change his calculation. He left with Sloane that night. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after the door closed. Then I sat down on the floor, which was something I had never done before, and which felt, in that moment, like the most honest response available to me. I stayed there for 30 minutes. Then I stood up, washed my face, and started making a list of what I needed to do next. That list is how I survived the months that followed. Not inspiration, not strength, at least not the kind that arrives already formed and ready to use. Just a list. Just the next item. And then the next one after that. Garrett's lawyers moved before I had fully processed what had happened. Within 72 hours of that Thursday night, I received a legal letter from a firm I had never heard of, outlining the terms of what it called an amicable separation. The letter was 26 pages. The language was engineered to be incomprehensible to anyone without a law degree, and the terms it described were designed to look reasonable while offering almost nothing. A settlement figure that would not cover 6 months of rent in the city I had lived in for 13 years. A timeline that compressed the entire divorce process into 60 days. And a clause on page 19, the kind of page that appears after people have stopped reading closely, that included a non-disclosure agreement covering my awareness of or involvement in Vostek's financial operations during the period of marriage. I read all 26 pages. I sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten dinner with Garrett for 11 years, and I read every word. What I understood, reading that clause on page 19, was that this was not just a divorce. This was an erasure. He wanted me gone and legally silenced before I had time to think clearly. Before anyone connected my name to the 400 pages of documents I had signed across 13 years of marriage. Before I understood what those signatures actually meant. I did not sign, not yet. I had an instinct, vague and unformed but persistent, that I needed more information before I put my name on anything else. 2 weeks later, I came home from a 12-hour shift to find the building's front door no longer recognized my key card. The building manager was waiting in the lobby. He was apologetic and could not look at me directly, which told me he had been told to expect this. My belongings were in boxes near the service entrance. My joint credit cards had been canceled that morning. My name had been removed from the lease. I discovered the credit cards at a grocery store 3 blocks away. When the first card was declined, and then the second, and then the third. while I was holding a container of orange juice and a box of crackers. I put the orange juice back. I bought the crackers with the cash in my pocket. I sat in my car in that parking lot and I thought, he planned this. He planned every single step of this in advance. The lawyer's letter and the 60-day timeline and the NDA clause on page 19 and the key card and the credit cards. All of it coordinated. All of it designed to happen before I had time to organize a response. I drove to a motel in Queens that charged by the week. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. I want to be precise about this because the timing matters to everything that follows. 6 weeks after that night in my kitchen, I signed the papers, not because the settlement was fair. It was not even close to fair, but because I had made the calculation and understood that I had a choice between two kinds of fighting, and I did not have the resources for both. I could fight the divorce terms, or I could fight for everything else. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in a law office that smelled like industrial cleaning products and institutional furniture. I was 4 months pregnant. I had $1,014 in a personal checking account that Garrett had not known about, which is the only reason I had anything at all, officially and legally. I was now Claire Harmon again, not Garrett Voss's wife, not anyone's wife. I was someone's mother. That was the thing I held on to in those first days. The only thing with enough weight to keep me from floating away into the specific panic that comes when you look at your life and cannot find any of the familiar landmarks. There is a heartbeat inside me that is not mine. I kept thinking, someone is counting on me to keep moving. So I kept moving. I need to say something here about money, and I need you to hear it in the most practical possible terms. Not as drama or cautionary tale, but as direct information. If you are married, maintain a personal bank account in your name only. Not a secret account, not something hidden or deceptive. Simply a personal account. Your money, your access, your independence. Tell your partner about it if you choose, but have it. The moment Garrett canceled our joint accounts, I had nothing, because I had trusted that ours meant equal access. It does not always mean that. Legal access and practical access are different things. And the difference between them can be the difference between surviving and not surviving the first 30 days. I am telling you this because someone should have told me at 32, and no one did. The motel was called the Riverside Inn, which was ambitious as names go, given there was no river visible from any window. Unit 14 on the second floor cost $280 a week, and the carpet had seen better decades. And the window unit made a sound at 3 in the morning that I eventually learned to sleep through. I paid by the week because I could not commit to a month. I worked at a retail financial services office that paid $14 an hour, enough to cover the motel and basic groceries with approximately $40 remaining at week's end. I ate crackers and peanut butter 3 nights out of 7. I drank store-brand ginger tea for the nausea, which was severe and arrived without warning at any hour. Every morning I woke before sunrise because my body had become its own battle. 5 months pregnant, working full shifts, sleeping on a mattress that was slightly too soft, eating food that was nutritious enough to sustain a pregnancy and not much more. I would grip the bathroom sink during the worst of it and breathe and tell myself, one more day, just this one. Then the professional destruction began. I noticed it the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what is different. A former colleague who always returned my texts within an hour took 3 days to respond, then did not respond to the next. My supervisor started looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. Then I saw the first article, not about me directly, never about me directly, because Sloane Crawford was too skilled for that. But coded language, careful placement. The kind of narrative architecture that does not say someone's name but leaves an unmistakable negative shape in the space around them. Sources close to Vostech suggest a difficult home environment preceded the CEO's recent personal changes. The translation was clear enough. She was unstable. She was difficult. She could not handle the world he was building. And his leaving her was understandable. Within 2 weeks, I was called into my supervisor's office. He was a decent man in an impossible position. He told me the firm had received some calls. He could not say from whom, and that given the public nature of my situation, the partners had decided a quieter transition would be better for everyone. I lost my job. 5 months pregnant. No income. The motel payment due in 4 days. I sat in my car outside the office for 45 minutes. I did not cry right away. I sat and watched people walk in and out with their coffee cups and their ordinary Tuesdays, and I thought about the word practical and how Garrett had used it the night he told me our marriage was over. We will figure out the practical arrangements, as if I were a logistical problem rather than a person. And then, sitting in that parking lot, a thought arrived that was cold and specific and clarifying. My name is on documents I have never read. I did not know yet what those documents contained, but I knew. with the sudden precision that sometimes comes at the end of a long confusion, that whatever was in those documents was the real reason for the clause on page 19 of the divorce letter. He was not just erasing me from his life. He was covering something. I drove back to the motel, and I started, for the first time in 13 years, to pay close attention. The eviction notice appeared on the door of my studio apartment on a Tuesday in the 6th week after the divorce was finalized. I had managed, briefly, to move from the motel into a small studio nearby, slightly more stable, slightly less depressing, but I had been juggling bills for 6 weeks, choosing the prenatal vitamins over the gas bill, choosing groceries over rent. The math had finally caught up to me. I found the notice when I came home from a double shift at 9:30 in the evening, standing in the hallway with my coat still on and my feet aching and a box of crackers under my arm. Final notice. Overdue balance. 30 days to vacate. I went inside. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, the notice in my hand, and I did the calculation for the 14th time that week. It came out the same way it had the 13 times before. There was no version of the math that worked. I had been 5 months pregnant when Garrett threw me out. I was now approaching 6. My body felt heavier every week, not just with the pregnancy, but with the accumulated weight of everything I had been carrying. The fear I did not have time to process during the day would arrive reliably at 3 in the morning, and I would lie on the floor mattress and breathe through it until it passed. I set the eviction notice on the floor beside me. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about my daughter, which was how I thought of her even then, before I knew for certain. I thought about what I wanted her to know about the months before she was born. Not that her mother had been defeated. That was the thing I was most determined about. Whatever else happened in this apartment, whatever the math said or the eviction notice said or Garrett's lawyers said, that specific outcome was the one I intended to prevent. I was thinking all of this when my phone rang. Unknown number. Garrett's lawyers had been using unknown numbers. I had stopped answering them 2 weeks ago. But something about the timing, something about the quality of that specific moment on the floor, made me pick up. A man's voice said, "Miss Harmon," not the voice of a lawyer. Lawyers have a certain professional cadence, efficient and detached. This voice was different, unhurried. The voice of someone who had never in his professional life been required to hurry. The voice said, "My name is James Ellison. I believe we have something important to discuss." I knew the name. Anyone in financial services in New York knew the name. James Ellison. Ellison Capital. The man whose picture appeared on the covers of financial magazines under headlines about Wall Street originals and market visionaries. The man Garrett had attempted to court for 2 years without ever getting a real meeting. I said, "How do you know who I am?" He said, "Because I have been watching your ex-husband very carefully for 5 years, and your name appears in documents connected to his operations in a way I need to understand." He paused. He said, "I am outside your building. I would like to come up. If you want me to leave after 5 minutes, I will leave and you will never hear from me again." I looked at the eviction notice on the floor. I looked at the ceiling. I said, "Second floor." The buzzer does not work. Just knock. He arrived in a dark overcoat with the specific posture of a man who does not spend much time being uncertain. He was taller than I had expected from photographs, and there was something in the quality of his attention that was unusual. Most people in positions of power have learned to perform interest while being only partially present. James Ellison looked at things the way someone looks at a problem they fully intend to solve. He looked at my apartment, really looked at it. The stack of bills on the table, and the eviction notice I had moved to the counter, and the prenatal vitamin bottles lined up by the sink. And his expression did something I had not anticipated. Not pity. Something colder and more useful than pity. He sat in the single chair. I sat on the edge of the mattress. He said, "I will be direct with you." "I prefer it," I said. "Go ahead," he said. 5 years ago, Garrett Voss and I co-managed a real estate development fund. It was a legitimate arrangement, properly structured, with appropriate oversight. Or so I believed. Over 18 months, Garrett falsified the project reports, rerouted profits into private accounts I was not aware of. And when the SEC began investigating, he arranged for a junior member of my team to take the fall. This man's name was Daniel Whitmore. He was 31 years old. He lost his career, then his marriage, then his health. He died 14 months ago. The room was very quiet, he said. "I have been building a case against Garrett since Daniel died. The problem is that every trail with meaningful evidence leads back to documents signed by someone with the legal authority to authorize those transfers." He looked at me steadily. He said, "Your signature, Ms. Harmon." I felt the floor shift. I said, "You are saying he set me up." He said, "I am saying he structured the documentation so that if the SEC ever examined it closely, the authorization trail would lead to you." Not to him. To you, I said, which means I could be prosecuted. He said yes. I sat with that for a moment. The weight of it was different from the eviction notice. More specific. More dangerous. I said, so you came here because you need something from me? He said yes. He did not try to soften it. I said, not because you want to help me, he said. At first, that was the plan. Yes, I appreciated the honesty. It was the most straightforward thing anyone had said to me in 6 weeks. I said, what do you need specifically? He said, I need you to look at financial documents. You are a CPA. You understand how to read balance sheets and transfer records. My team has been looking at these documents for months and cannot interpret them the way someone who knows how Garrett thinks would be able to. I said, and what do I receive in exchange? He said, legal protection. My attorney's working on your behalf. And if what I believe is inside those documents is actually there, the truth, which I suspect is something you have been wanting for a while. I looked at the eviction notice on the counter. I thought about my daughter. I thought about that clause on page 19 of the divorce letter, the one about my awareness of Vostek's financial operations, the one I had known instinctively was important without understanding precisely why. I said, I will look at your documents. He began to speak, I said. I am not finished, he waited. I said, I will look at your documents, not because I trust you. I do not know you yet, but because I need to understand what my name is attached to before anyone else discovers it. That is my reason, not you, me. He nodded. I said, additionally, if I find what you believe is there, I am not your witness. I am your partner. My name appears on the findings. I have equal access to everything. If that is not acceptable, we can end this conversation now and I will handle this another way. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that is actually an assessment. He said, agreed. I said, then I will be at your office Monday morning at 9. He stood and put on his gloves with the methodical care of someone who has been dressing for cold weather in this city for many years. At the door, he paused. He said, Miss Harmon, for what it is worth, I do not believe you knew what you were signing. I said, I know I did not. He nodded and left. Here is something I have thought about many times since. When you are in genuine trouble, the people who offer to help you will almost always need something in return. That is not cynicism. That is simply how the world operates. And understanding it is not the same as being bitter about it. The question is not whether someone needs something from the arrangement. The question is whether they are honest about what they need. James Ellison told me the truth before I agreed to anything. He told me he needed a witness. He did not dress it up or reframe it or make it sound like something it was not. That honesty was the foundation of everything that followed. If someone needs to hide their reason for helping you, that is the most important thing you can know about them. The people who are honest about what they need, even when it is uncomfortable to say, those are the people worth trusting with the difficult parts of your life. I learned that in Unit 14 of the Riverside Inn in Queens. Sitting on a mattress on the floor with an eviction notice on the counter and a stranger's business card in my hand. It was not the most elegant classroom, but the lesson has not left me. Ellison Capital occupied the top 4 floors of a building on Park Avenue that had the quiet, assured authority of old money expressed in steel and glass. I arrived Monday morning in the only professional clothes that still fit, a navy blazer I had bought on clearance and dark slacks, with an adjustable waistband that I was grateful for and intended never to mention. The receptionist had been told to expect me. She gave me a visitor badge and brought me to a conference room on the 38th floor where a laptop, 4 years of Vostek financial filings printed in binders, and a cup of coffee were waiting on the table. James was in a meeting. There was a note on the table in his handwriting. It said, tell me what you see, no title, no formal briefing, no team of analysts to guide me through the process, just the documents and my eyes and the specific kind of clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. I sat down. I opened the first binder. I started at the beginning. I want to explain what I was looking for, because it matters to understand how I found it. I had been a certified public accountant for 14 years. In that time, I had reviewed thousands of financial documents for dozens of clients, and I had developed what I can only describe as a sense for when numbers are telling a different story than the words around them. Numbers have a logic, a natural flow. Money moves in patterns that reflect how the people managing it think, and when those patterns are disrupted or concealed, there is a texture to it, a kind of friction, that a trained eye can feel before it can fully articulate what it is seeing. I went through the first 2 binders without finding that friction. The third binder was ordinary. The fourth contained a section on subsidiary development accounts that looked correct on first reading and felt slightly wrong on the second. I spent 4 hours on that section, on day 6, at 11:40 at night, drinking cold coffee and working in the conference room after everyone else had left. I found it. Not because James had told me where to look, but because I knew Garrett's patterns in a way that no external analyst could. I had watched him organize information for 13 years. He had a private shorthand in the way he named files and structured account hierarchies, a system he had developed during Vostek's founding years when he was working alone and needed to navigate quickly between dozens of active documents. I had seen that system on his personal laptop many times. Birthday gifts he was hiding from me, vacation planning, small ordinary things. He had used the same system for the shell companies. 3 Delaware-registered entities with names that followed his pattern precisely. Accounts routing development fund money through those entities and into private holding accounts I had never been shown. Transfers authorized over a period of 4 years under my signature for projects that, when I cross-referenced them against the addresses listed on the authorization documents, did not exist. I printed everything. I assembled the key documents in order. I put them in a folder. I walked down the hall to James's office. It was nearly midnight. He was still at his desk. I put the folder in front of him without saying anything. He opened it. He read through the document slowly and with complete focus, and I stood on the other side of the desk and watched his face. When he looked up, I said he was not just routing money through me. He built the entire structure so that if anyone ever came looking, every trail with my signature points to me authorizing the fraudulent transfers. He was not protecting himself from the SEC. He was redirecting the SEC toward me. James looked at the documents for a moment longer. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "About an hour. But I think I suspected something was wrong for longer than that. I just did not have the specific information to form the suspicion clearly." He said, "Are you all right?" I considered the question honestly. I said no, but I am clear. And at this moment, clear is more useful. He nodded slowly, and there was something in his face that I could not name precisely, but which looked like a recalibration, like something he had assumed about me had been revised. For 3 days after I found the documents, things moved forward in a way that felt like genuine momentum. James brought me into the senior boardroom. 3 analysts confirmed my findings after a combined 6 hours with the binders. A preliminary report was drafted. Vostek's board of directors received a formal notification from Ellison Capital's legal team. I slept through the night for the first time since the motel. I ate a full meal at a table. I used actual silverware. I thought, maybe this is finally moving in the right direction. I should have known by then that forward movement is not the same as safety. On the 4th day, I arrived to find James standing in the hallway outside the conference room with his phone in his hand, an expression I had not seen from him before. He said, "Come in and close the door." A financial news website had published a story that morning. The headline read, "Vostek ex-wife named in preliminary inquiry. Sources question true motives." The story had been carefully constructed. It was not crude. Sloan Crawford did not do crude work. The narrative it built was this. Claire Harmon, recently divorced from the CEO she had been married to for 11 years, was using her pregnancy and the natural public sympathy it generated to deflect attention from her own potential involvement in Vostek's financial irregularities. Sources described her as opportunistic. Sources described her cooperation with Ellison Capital as motivated by bitterness rather than genuine concern for the truth. Sources were not named. They never are. My phone had been in my bag. When I took it out, I had 430 notifications. I put it back. James said, "Someone inside this office sold the story. We have identified who. I am handling it." I said, "Handling it does not put this back in the box." He said, "No, it does not." I said, "What else?" He looked at me with the particular quality of someone preparing to deliver a second piece of information they would prefer not to deliver. He handed me a document. I read it standing up. The motion cited my current financial instability and the ongoing legal questions surrounding her potential involvement in Vostek financial operations as grounds for a preemptive custody determination regarding the unborn child. He was going to try to take my daughter, using the story Sloan had planted that morning, using the leak from inside the office where I had spent 6 days finding the evidence that would expose him. He had moved faster than us. He had anticipated the shape of what was coming and preempted it. I handed the document back to James. I said, "I need an hour." I went to the bathroom at the end of the hallway. I sat on the bench just inside the door. I held my hands on my stomach and I breathed. I allowed myself, for 1 hour, to feel the full weight of what was happening. Not just the anger, which was there and was useful, but the specific grief that lives underneath anger when the person who was supposed to protect someone is the person doing the harm. 1 hour. Then I washed my face, straightened my jacket, and walked back into the hallway. James was waiting. I said, "I need your legal team on the custody motion today. That is the first priority." he said. I have already called them, I said. Good. Now tell me the timeline for the board presentation, he said. Claire. I said, the timeline. James, he looked at me for a moment. Then he told me the timeline. I want to tell you about the 48 hours that followed, because I think it is important to understand how close I came to losing everything. Not figuratively, but in the most literal sense available. On Wednesday morning, I was in the conference room reviewing the board presentation structure with James's legal team, when my vision went strange at the edges. The edges of things blurred slightly, like a photograph that is perfectly focused at the center and soft at the perimeter. My hands felt distant from my body. The voices in the room became momentarily difficult to organize into meaning. I stood up and said, I need a moment, and my legs did not respond the way I expected. The next thing I remember clearly is a different room, brighter, with fluorescent lighting and a beeping that resolved, as I came more fully back to myself, into the sound of a fetal monitor. Preeclampsia. The doctor who explained it was a woman in her late 40s who sat on the edge of my hospital bed rather than standing at its foot. She had a direct, unhurried way of speaking that I found clarifying rather than alarming. She said, this is a serious condition, and I need you to understand that, but it is also manageable. What is not manageable is the current trajectory of your stress levels, which are, I want to be honest with you, among the highest I have seen in a patient your age. I said, I am aware, she said. I am not asking you to stop whatever you are doing. I am asking you to identify one thing in your current situation that you can reduce. Not eliminate, just reduce. And do that one thing. I said, I will sleep more. She said, that is a start. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. She said, your daughter has a strong heartbeat. She is holding on. So should you. I stayed in the hospital for 2 nights. James visited on the second afternoon, which I had not expected. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He placed a folder on the table, then looked at it and looked at me and put it back in his bag. He said, how are you? I said, tell me what is in the folder. He said, it can wait. I said, James. He opened his bag. He took out the folder. He placed it on the table. It was the custody motion, not the original one. An amendment. Garrett's legal team had obtained the news coverage from 4 days earlier, the story Sloan had planted, and had submitted it to the court as evidence supporting their argument for his fitness as a guardian relative to mine. They had also submitted a declaration from Garrett himself, stating that he had grave concerns about my emotional stability given my current circumstances and involvement in an ongoing legal matter. He was using the hospital stay he had anticipated before I had even been admitted. I put the document down. I said, he prepared for this. James said, yes, I said. He expected me to be hospitalized. James said, his lawyers were ready. 47 hours after collapsing in the conference room, I received confirmation that a representative of Garrett Voss's legal team had contacted the hospital requesting my medical records. The request had been denied under privacy law, but the attempt had been made. He was trying to take my daughter from a hospital bed, using the body that was growing her against me. I lay in that hospital bed with the fetal monitor running, and I made a list, not of everything I had lost, not of everything he had taken, but of everything that still existed, everything that was still mine, everything that he had not managed to reach. The list was not long, but the most important item on it was the steady line on the monitor beside me. And that was enough. I was discharged on Thursday morning with a monitoring protocol and a prescription and instructions to reduce my stress load that I received with the respectful nod of a person who intends to do the opposite. I called James from the parking lot. I said, I need to be at the office tomorrow. He said, Claire. I said, I need to be at the office tomorrow. The board presentation needs to be ready within 2 weeks, and I am going to build it myself. A pause. He said, are you sure? I said, I found the evidence. I understand it better than anyone in that building. I should be the one to present it, he said. All right, I said. And the custody motion, he said. My family law attorney filed a counter motion the morning you left for Connecticut. I said, good. I drove to the office. I had 42 slides to build and approximately 14 days to build them. I got started. There is something I want to say about the experience of having 2 catastrophic things happen within 48 hours of each other, because it does not get talked about honestly. When the second thing arrives, you do not have the same response you had to the first. You are already in a kind of shock that functions differently from ordinary fear. It is more like recalibration. Like a part of your brain says, fine, adjust, keep moving. People ask me sometimes how I kept going during that period. How I built 42 slides from a hospital discharge to a boardroom presentation in 14 days while 6 months pregnant and on blood pressure monitoring and with a custody motion pending. The honest answer is that I did not have the option of not keeping going. That option had been removed from the table by the specific combination of circumstances. And so I stopped looking for it and started looking at what was actually available. What was available was a laptop and a binder of financial documents and a conference room and a cup of coffee that James's assistant replaced without being asked every time it went cold. That was what I had. That was enough. On a Thursday evening, 11 days before the board presentation, James asked me to meet him in his private office, not the main conference room, his personal workspace on the top floor, a quieter room with a view of the East River that turned the color of hammered copper in the late afternoon light. He was standing at the window when I arrived. His posture had a quality I had not seen in it before, tighter. Like a man who has been carrying something he intends to finally put down. He said, "Sit down, please." I sat. He turned from the window. He said, "There is something I should have told you the night I came to your door in Queens. Before this goes any further, you need to know it." I waited. He said, "I did not find you by accident. I have known about you for 2 years. I have been building a case against Garrett for 5 years. And for the past 2, I understood that the evidence I needed was connected to someone he had been married to, someone who had signed documents he used. I was waiting for an opening, for a moment when you might be willing and positioned to cooperate." He paused. He said, "When Garrett moved against you the way he did, when he threw you out and canceled your accounts and began the campaign to discredit you, I recognized it as the moment I had been waiting for. I came to you with a plan. And the plan was to use your situation. I told myself there was a difference between using the situation and using you. But sitting here now, I am not sure that distinction holds." The room was very quiet. I said, "Why are you telling me now?" He said, "Because you are about to walk into a boardroom and face the man who endangered you, and you deserve to do that with complete information. And because around day 3, when you walked into my office with documents you had found yourself, and I realized you had not been waiting for me to tell you what to do, I stopped thinking of you as a witness. I should have told you the truth then. I did not. That is on me." He placed a folder on the table. He said, "There is something else." He said, 3 days ago, my forensic accounting team found something in a parallel set of filings. Business entities registered in Massachusetts. Different accounts. Different names. Same structural pattern as everything you found in the Vostek documents." He opened the folder. He said, "There is another woman." I looked at the page. The name on the authorization signatures was Helen Marsh, an architect based in Boston. 36 years old. I said, "How long?" James said, 7 years. 7 years. Garrett and I had been married for 4 years when this began. I said, "Does she know?" He said, "Not yet." I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the night in my kitchen, the coat he never took off, the way he said, "We will figure out the practical arrangements," as if I were a logistical problem rather than a person. I thought about Helen Marsh in Boston, who had been signing documents she did not understand for 7 years while believing she knew who she was with. I said, "Can you get me her phone number?" James looked at me carefully. He said, "Legally, the most strategic approach would be to have our attorneys make first contact through official channels." I said, "I understand what the strategic approach is. That is not what I asked." He held my gaze for a moment. He said, "Yes, I can get you her number." I called Helen Marsh at 8:47 that evening. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was measured, the voice of someone who answers unknown numbers with caution because she has learned caution is warranted. I said, "My name is Claire Harmon. I was married to Garrett Voss. I believe we need to talk." A silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. She said, "I know who you are." I said, "Then you may have some idea of why I am calling." She said, "I have suspected something for a while. I just did not know what shape it would take when it arrived." We talked for 2 hours, not as adversaries, not as people competing for something, but as 2 women on opposite ends of the same lie, comparing notes in the careful, exhausted way of people who have been carrying something alone for too long and have finally found someone who understands the exact weight of it. She had a son who was 5 years old. Garrett had told her he traveled extensively for work. She had accepted that because the life he had built with her in Boston felt real and consistent, and she had had no reason to question it until the documents she was asked to sign became more frequent and more pressured over the past year. She said, "I knew something was wrong with those documents. I am an architect. I understand contracts. Some of what he asked me to sign did not match what he described." I said, "Did you keep copies?" She said, "I keep copies of everything." I said, "Helen, I need to ask you something directly." She said, "Go ahead." I said, "Are you willing to come forward? Not for me, for yourself, for your son, and for a man named Daniel Whitmore, which is something I can explain when we have more time." A long pause. She said, yes. I have been waiting for someone to explain the shape of this. Now that I can see it clearly. Yes. She overnighted her documentation to James's office. It arrived 2 mornings later. I also need to tell you about Sloane Crawford. 3 days before the board presentation, Sloane requested a meeting with James's legal team. She arrived at the office on a Tuesday morning looking like someone who had dressed very carefully to appear calm. James told me afterward what she had said. She had forwarded documents she believed were routine. She had not known they were fraudulent. She had managed a narrative she believed to be true, which does not absolve her, but complicates her. She had also been used. James said to me afterward, she was used. The same way you were. In a different way. I said, I know. He said, does that change how you feel about what she did to you? I said, what she did to my reputation was deliberate, and its consequences were significant. Those are 2 separate things from her not knowing the full scope of the fraud. I can hold both of them without requiring them to resolve into something simpler. He said, can you? I said, I can. I did not meet with Sloane. I did not need to. The truth was going to do enough on its own. I had sat in James's office with the folder on the table and his admission in the air between us. I did not respond with anger. I responded with something quieter and harder to articulate, a kind of recalibration. Like finding out that the map you have been using is accurate but drawn at a different scale than you assumed. I said, I need 3 days. He said, of course. I said, do not call me. Do not send anyone. He said, all right. I drove to my sister's house in Connecticut that night. Diane Harmon is 8 years older than me and an emergency room nurse who has worked nights at a Hartford hospital for 15 years. She is not a person who embellishes things or softens difficult truths or wraps uncomfortable information in language designed to protect you from its edges. She is, in the best possible sense, exactly what she appears to be. I arrived at her house at 11:30 at night. She opened the door before I knocked. Because she had been waiting since I called from the highway. She made tea. She sat across from me at her kitchen table. She said nothing. I told her everything, start to finish. From the night in my kitchen to the folder with Helen Marsh's name in it. 3 hours. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she poured us both fresh cups and sat with it for a moment. Then she said, he told you the truth when he did not have to. I said, he should have told me the truth earlier. She said, yes, he should have. I said, he came to me because he needed something. She said yes, and he was honest about that, which is different from pretending he did not. I looked at my cup. I said, he watched me. For 2 years. He knew things about my situation before he knocked on my door. She said yes. I said, that is a manipulation. She said, it is a use of information. Whether it is a manipulation depends on what he did with it. Did he lie to you? I said, he told me part of the truth. She said, did he use the partial truth to harm you? I thought about it honestly. I said, no. She said, did what he did after meeting you help you or hurt you? I said, help me, considerably. She said, then here is the question I would sit with. Not whether his original intentions were pure, but whether the person in front of you now is someone you can work with. Whether the way he has operated since he walked into your life has been, on balance, toward your good or toward his own. I sat with that for a while. I said his own in some ways, mine in most of them. She said, then you have your answer. I stayed at Diane's house for 3 days. We did not talk about James or Garrett or the board presentation for most of that time. We watched films she had recorded and meant to watch for months. We cooked actual meals with vegetables and protein and adequate seasoning, which I had not done in approximately 2 months. We took walks in the gray November air with Diane's enormous and serene dog, who was named Edward, and who walked with the quiet dignity of a creature that has made peace with the world entirely. On the 3rd morning, I woke before Diane and sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the early light coming through the window, and I thought about what I wanted the next chapter of my life to look like. Not the next week, not the next phase of the legal situation. The next chapter. I thought about Maggie. That was what I had decided to call her. Margaret shortened to Maggie, after my grandmother, who had been a woman of great patience and greater stubbornness. I thought about what I wanted Maggie to know about her mother. Not the things that had been done to her mother, what her mother had chosen to do. On the 3rd afternoon, I called James. He picked up on the 2nd ring. I said, I am coming back. He said, all right. I said, 2 conditions. He said, name them. I said, first, I present at the board meeting myself, not as a witness, as the analyst who found the evidence and understands it. My presentation, my slides, my voice. He said, done. I said, second, the custody motion. I need your family law attorney to file an emergency counter motion this week, not next week. He said she filed it the morning you left. I paused. I said, why? He said, because it was the right thing to do. I sat with that for a moment. I said, James. He said, yes. I said, what was it like? Working with Daniel Whitmore. A pause. He said, he was 31 years old, and he had the specific quality of someone who works harder than they need to because they believe in what they are doing, not for the compensation. For the work itself, he paused again. He said, I should have protected him better. I trusted Garrett, and I trusted the structure, and I did not look closely enough at the specific things that should have told me something was wrong. And Daniel paid for that, I said. So did I. He said yes, and I am sorry for my part in that. I said, I know. I said, I will be at the office tomorrow morning at 9. I have 42 slides to finish. He said, I will have coffee ready. For the 2 weeks that followed, things moved in a way that felt, for the first time in many months, like solid ground. The board presentation came together. The custody counter motion was proceeding. Garrett's attorneys made 2 procedural errors that James's team caught and documented. I held what I had carefully, without letting it turn into certainty. I had learned that forward movement and safety are not the same thing, and that the distance between them is exactly where the next blow tends to arrive. But this time, the blow did not come. This time, what came next was the boardroom. Vostek's corporate headquarters occupied 12 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. I had been inside the building before, many times. In the years when I was Garrett's wife and fixture at company events where I stood beside him and understood exactly what was being discussed in every financial presentation and never said so because he preferred it that way. I had not been inside since the night he came home with Sloan, in the elevator. James stood beside me and said nothing. I appreciated that. The best kind of support, I have come to understand, is the kind that does not require the other person to perform confidence they may not fully feel. He did not tell me I was going to do well. He simply stood beside me, which was what I needed. Presence without pressure. The doors opened onto the executive floor. Garrett was already in the boardroom when we arrived. I saw him through the glass wall before the door was opened. He was standing at the window with his back to the room. And there was a quality to his posture that I recognized from the years of our marriage. The particular set of his shoulders when he was managing something he did not want to manage. He turned when the door opened. He looked at me. He looked at James. He said, quietly, Claire, I said, good morning. The board chairman gestured to the table. 12 chairs. 12 people who understood the weight of what they were about to hear. 2 SEC observers in the back corner, which James had arranged and which Garrett had not been informed of in advance. I set my laptop on the table. I connected it to the display screen. Thank you all for being here. I will take approximately 40 minutes, and I will try to be as clear and specific as possible. I had built 42 slides. Each slide represented a specific piece of the financial pattern I had identified, a specific transfer, a specific shell entity, a specific authorization bearing my signature, and a description of what I had been told I was signing versus what the document actually authorized. My voice was steady throughout, not because I was not afraid. I was. Fear is not the absence of stability. Fear is simply the presence of stakes. And the stakes in that room were as high as any I had faced. But they were also, finally, fully visible to me, which made them navigable in a way that fear in the dark never is. I moved through the slides methodically. Every fraudulent transfer, every shell entity in Delaware, every authorization tied to projects that did not exist at the listed addresses. The naming convention that I recognized from 13 years of watching Garrett organize his thinking. Then the Massachusetts filings. Helen Marsh's name, a photograph of her documentation, which her attorneys had submitted to James's team. A 7-year parallel structure, identical in method to the Vostek one. The room went very still when that slide appeared. One of the SEC observers in the back made a note. I heard the scratch of pen on paper in the silence. Garrett had not spoken since I began. He sat across the table with his expression carefully managed, and I watched the management of it become more effortful as the slides progressed. By slide 30, the effort was visible. By slide 40, he looked like a man who was very tired. When I finished, I said I did not know what I was signing. I want to be clear about that. I was told these were routine authorizations. I was told the business was too complex for me to understand, and I accepted that because I trusted the person telling me. That trust was misused in a specific and sustained way over a period of 4 years. I have audio documentation of many conversations in which I was directed to sign without reading, and I have made those recordings available to the legal team. I connected a small device to the laptop. I played 12 seconds of a recording from 4 years ago. Garrett's voice, casual and unhurried, saying it is just a development authorization. Claire, nobody reads these. Sign on the highlighted lines and I will explain everything this weekend when we have time. The quality of the silence in the room changed. The board chairman looked at Garrett. He said, "Mr. Voss, is there anything you would like to respond to?" Garrett's hands were still folded on the table. He said, "Claire." His voice had lost the careful management. He sounded like someone older than the man who had stood in my kitchen 11 months ago and told me he was sorry this had happened this way. He said, "You do not have to do this." I said, "I am already doing it." The chairman said, "The board will proceed with the preliminary vote. The motion is the placement of Vostek under temporary administrative oversight pending a full SEC review." Garrett said, "This is not." The chairman said, "The vote, please." 12 votes, 12 in favor. One of the SEC observers stood and walked to Garrett's end of the table. He said, "Mr. Voss, we will need to ask you to come with us." Garrett looked at me. In those seconds, I saw something I had not expected. Not rage, something more complicated. The expression of a man who is finally seeing something he has been avoiding looking at directly and finding that it looks back. He said, "I am sorry." "Claire," I looked at him. I said, "I know." He was escorted out of the boardroom with the particular efficiency of a process that has been prepared in advance. The room settled into a quiet that was different from the previous silences. Something had resolved. The specific tension that builds in a room when a question has been present too long had finally been answered. James placed his hand briefly on the table near mine. Not touching, just present. The board chairman looked at me and said, "Ms. Harmon, on behalf of this board, I want to express both our gratitude for your testimony and our sincere apology for the circumstances that led you here." I nodded. Then I collected my laptop and my notes and I walked out of the Vostek boardroom. Through the lobby where the security guard nodded at me differently than he had an hour ago, and out through the glass doors into the cold November air. I stood on the sidewalk. The city moved around me with its customary indifference. And for the first time in 8 months, I felt something that had no specific drama to it, no resolution soundtrack, no particular weight. I felt like I was standing on something solid, just that, solid ground. 6 weeks after the board meeting, James asked me to dinner. Not a meeting, dinner. He called on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "I would like to have dinner with you this Thursday, not to discuss the case, not to review documents, just dinner." I said, "Is this a date?" He said, "I would like it to be." I said, "James, I am 6 months pregnant. I have been through the most eventful year of my life. I am on blood pressure medication and I sleep 9 hours a night on doctor's orders. I am not sure I am the most appealing dinner companion at this particular moment." He said, "I asked you, which means I have already considered all of that. I thought about it." I said, "All right, but I choose the restaurant." He said, "Of course, I chose Hargrove's. I chose it deliberately, because it was the restaurant Garrett had called our restaurant for 11 years, because it was where he had proposed to me and later taken Sloan. As I had learned from a news item I read exactly once before deciding never to read such things again, because it was the kind of place that holds the memory of who has been there, and I wanted to walk into it as the person I was now, not the person I had been. I wore a dark green dress I had bought myself with my own money. I wore it because I wanted to. James arrived at my door at 7 precisely. We walked into Hargrove's at 7:15. The warmth closed around us. The room was full with the particular richness of a Thursday evening in November. The kind of night when the city decides to make its dinners last. Crystal, candlelight, the low conversation of people who have nowhere else they are required to be. I saw him before he saw us. Garrett was at the corner table, the same corner table. He was with 2 men I recognized as lawyers, which meant the dinner was not social, but the restaurant was still the restaurant he defaulted to when he needed to feel like himself. That piece of information settled in me with a texture I did not examine too closely. He looked up. He saw me. He saw James. The water glass slipped from his fingers. His lawyer grabbed it, but not before the water spread across the white tablecloth in a slow, inevitable bloom. I met his eyes. I nodded. Not warmly, not coldly. Simply, "I see you. I have been seeing you clearly for some time now." Then I walked to my table. James held the chair. I sat. He sat across from me. He looked at the menu with the calm attention he brought to everything. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes. I chose this restaurant on purpose. I wanted to walk through that door and feel what I feel now." He said, "What do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Like myself." He smiled. Not the controlled professional smile I had seen in meetings. Something quieter and more private, the smile of a person who is not performing. I said, "That sounds smaller than I mean it." He said, "No. I think I understand exactly what you mean. We had dinner. We talked. Genuinely talked. about things that had nothing to do with Garrett or Vostek or legal proceedings. He told me about growing up in a small town in Vermont and believing as a child that New York was a place that existed only in films. I told him about my grandmother Margaret, after whom I intended to name my daughter, who had worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years and had an opinion about every set of numbers she had ever encountered. He laughed at that. A real laugh. I thought, this is what it looks like when things work correctly. Garrett caught up to me on the sidewalk as I was leaving. James stayed in the doorway of the restaurant. I had not asked him to. He simply understood. I turned. Garrett looked like a diminished version of the man I had married. Not physically. His coat was still good, his posture still upright, but something interior had collapsed, and the exterior had not yet caught up to the change. He said, "Claire, can we talk for a moment?" I said. "All right," he said. "I am sorry. I know that is inadequate. I know it does not touch what I actually did, but I need you to know that I am." I looked at him. I said, "Garrett, the thing I have thought about most, the thing that has taken me the longest to make sense of, is not the leaving. I want you to hear that. Marriages end. People change. I can understand that," he said. "Then what?" I said. "You put my name on documents designed to send me to prison if anything went wrong. You took everything I had in the space of a week. You tried to take my daughter from a hospital bed, and through all of it, you never once considered what it would cost me, because you had decided I did not matter enough to cost anything." He said nothing. I said, "That is what I have been sitting with. Not that you left, but that you looked at 13 years and decided I was a liability to manage." He said, "I was someone different then." I said, "I know. I have thought about that too. The person you became when the money arrived. That person made those choices. But it was still you, Garrett. You made them." He said, "What do I do with that?" I said, "I do not know. That is not my work to do. That is yours." He said, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No. I am just done." I turned and walked back to the door. James held it open. I did not look back. That was the moment the chapter actually closed. Let me tell you the endings, because endings matter and I want to tell them accurately. Garrett Voss pleaded guilty to 4 counts of financial fraud, document falsification, and fiduciary breach. He was sentenced to 32 months in federal prison. Vostek was placed under a restructuring committee overseen by Ellison Capital for 18 months. His personal assets were partially frozen pending civil settlements. The custody motion was dismissed. Not deferred. Dismissed. Garrett's legal team withdrew it on a Monday morning in December. In the same week he entered his guilty plea, without a hearing ever taking place. Helen Marsh cooperated fully with the investigation and was cleared of any wrongdoing. She returned to her architectural practice in Boston. She called me on my daughter's first birthday. She said, "I just wanted to know how she is doing." I said, "She is excellent. She has strong opinions about avocado." Helen laughed. She said, "What is her name?" I said, "Margaret. We call her Maggie." She said, "That is a good name." I said, "It was my grandmother's." Sloane Crawford cooperated with the investigation in exchange for reduced exposure. She had not known the full scope of what Garrett was doing legally, though she had been willing to harm me when she believed it protected something she valued. Those two things were both true, and I held them both without requiring them to resolve into something simpler. She left New York. I did not see her again. James Ellison did not become my husband quickly. I want to be precise about this, because the actual timeline is different from the version that might be assumed. And the actual version is the one that meant something. We had dinner in November. We had more dinners. We disagreed about things. I told him when I thought he was wrong, and he listened. And sometimes he changed his position, and sometimes he explained his reasoning, and I changed mine. We had the kind of arguments that two people who respect each other have when they do not agree. The kind that end in understanding rather than in one person managing the other into silence. 14 months after he knocked on the door of my apartment in Queens. We married in my sister Diane's backyard in Connecticut on an afternoon in September, when her garden was doing everything it had been building toward all summer. Small ceremony. 12 people. Diane's dog Edward present and entirely serene. Maggie, who was 9 months old and deeply opinionated about being held by anyone she had not personally approved, sat in my arms during the vows and ate a flower from my bouquet, which I let her do because the moment was more important than the arrangement. James cried during the vows. Not dramatically. The way a person cries when something they have hoped for without fully naming it finally arrives. Diane gave a toast that ended with, "I watched my sister lose everything, and I watched her build it all back with her own hands. The only thing James did was stay out of her way." James laughed. I laughed. Maggie, who had located a piece of wedding cake, expressed her opinion at volume. And that, in the truest sense, was that. The real ending happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning about 9 months after the board meeting. I was in my kitchen, which was a real kitchen in a real apartment with good light and a window that looked out over the street below. And Maggie was in her bouncer on the floor conducting her ongoing commentary on the world, which required no audience and took no breaks. I poured a cup of coffee. I stood at the window. The city outside was doing what the city does, moving with its customary indifference toward everything that is not itself. Brilliant and enormous and completely unconcerned with any of us. I thought, I am all right. Not because everything had resolved into something clean and simple, because it had not. Not because I had been spared something, because I had not. Not because James is a good man and good to us, though he is, but because somewhere in those 8 months, in the motel room and the hospital bed and the boardroom and the sidewalk outside Hargrove's, I had found out what I was made of when everything else was taken away, and what was left was enough. It had always been enough. I had simply needed the specificity of losing everything to understand that what remained was the thing that had been real all along. Garrett did not take that from me. He simply, by taking everything else, made it visible. I do not recommend the method, but I am not sorry for what it taught me. If you are in the middle of something right now, something that feels larger than you have the resources to manage, something that arrives in waves at 3 in the morning when everything is quiet and the fear is loudest, I want you to hear one thing. You do not need to be fearless. You need to keep going while you are afraid. That is the entire instruction. There is nothing more complicated than that. Read what you sign. Keep your own account. Document everything from the beginning. Not because you are planning for the worst, but because your memory is not as reliable as it feels. Understand the arrangements you enter, and ask clearly what they cost the person offering them. Look up from your own wound long enough to see who else is carrying something similar, because you are almost never the only one, and you are always stronger when you find each other. These are not extraordinary acts. They are the ordinary acts of a person who has decided to take herself seriously. I took myself seriously in a motel room in Queens with $14 in my account and a heartbeat inside me that was not mine. That was where it began. Everything else followed from there. Take care of yourselves. Read what you sign, and know. With the certainty I have carried since the Tuesday morning I stood at the window with my coffee and finally understood it fully. Rock bottom has a floor, and the floor holds.